Wednesday, October 28th, 2020. Thank you so much for joining us today. We have a Rockfin exclusive to start, unlimited hangout, Last American Vagabond special today, where we are going to be discussing something that we've been talking about a little bit around the side that Whitney Webb has been teasing on Twitter and different places, that is really about this really alarming escalation of where we're going, this sort of where we're seeing the same people tied in with 9/11, essentially simulating for election chaos and different things we're seeing towards the election that seem to benefit the groups that they're involved with, and seeming to blame or set up the blame to be on certain groups that they've been seeding to for us to be afraid of for quite a long time. And all boils down to this kind of problem reaction solution game where they're justifying the things that they've always been trying to put in. And this is all the things we've been talking about on this show. And today this specifically ties in with the escalation of this whole COVID-19 scaremongering tactic, as well as the election and how they're coming together and how this is going to be abused. And Whitney Webb is here to talk about all of her research in this regard, as she's been really leading this, as far as I can tell, everywhere. No one else seems to want to even touch on this stuff. So thank you, Whitney Webb, for joining the dual show, I guess, today. So how are you?
I'm doing well. I'm very happy to collaborate through my page, Unlimited Hangout, with the Last American Vagabond for our quote-unquote election special. It may not be like a lot of other election specials you may be watching in alternative media, because we're talking about things that I have been writing about, and I know Ryan also has been covering for well over a year, that have everything to do with the 2020 election. And, you know, it's very interesting that, you know, we were capable of seeing this, so what is now being framed as the inevitability of chaos in the result of the 2020 election back earlier this year, as early as January, when I published my series on a company called Cyber Reason that has deep ties to both US and Israeli intelligence and has been simulating chaos for the 2020 general election for well over a year, actually 2 years. And a lot of the things they predicted are exactly what mainstream media is now saying are bound to happen in places like Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and other battleground states. So to start off, we're going to show you something very interesting that top officials from DHS were saying earlier this year in March, a month when pretty much most Americans were not paying attention to what DHS was saying, because of course this March is when the coronavirus lockdowns and a lot of the coronavirus crisis really began in earnest and started to upend normal life and usher us in, or attempt to usher us into, the quote-unquote new normal. So with that being said, I'll let Ryan lead on this part.
Yeah, this part was really, really alarming because of the tie-ins of things we've been seeing for such a long time. And whether it's anti-Semitism or other variations of hate, or things that are very real, but that they use to cover or justify removing things that aren't that even remotely, such as our work. And this is the kind of thing we're seeing converge here, that they're justifying this almost government-wide effort to go after what they're claiming is this domestic threat, which is specifically these groups that they claim are somehow collaborating or becoming this kind of foreign entity. And you'll see in this video we're going to watch that they even claim that these groups, these domestic militias they're claiming, which some of these, by the way, are like strict constitutionalists. So it's a really weird situation to see, but that they're calling them foreign entities, even though we're talking about domestic individuals. And I found that to be very, very telling. So this is the article we're talking about here, Homeland Security, and it talks about extremism building to the doorstep of another 9/11, which is the real point here, is that they're seeding this idea that this is going to be the next 9/11. Even this event that hasn't happened yet is already something that they're pointing to. It's very interesting. And of course, the anti-Semitism hearing, which this is really all about. Now let's get to the video, and I'll show you some clips here that I thought really stood out as alarming from more than just the individual that we first noticed. Now let me get this shared for that specific video real quick. Here we go. Okay, so let's take a peek at this. Make sure the sound is good.
Our extraordinary slate of witnesses from the FBI and Department of Homeland Security for coming here today to testify on the federal government's response to the rise in anti-Semitic domestic terrorism. And I'm sure in the process, we'll also be focusing on generally the issue of domestic terrorism. This is not a question.
I want to just add right off the bat that the idea that we're talking about anti-Semitism and the idea that it is domestic terrorism now, right? I mean, Whitney's been pointing this out, like that is, it's So there's plenty of other versions of hate that exist. Why is this one specifically becoming not just, a hate crime or whatever, even though that's wildly undefined, but it's becoming terrorism, right? I mean, it just seems like a really interesting jump that leads into where they're kind of guiding this.
Right.
Of
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, well, I was just going to say that people that watched our video on the seeding of the Dark Winter PSYOP that they are building towards this bioterror event later in the year, the quote unquote darkest winter in modern US history, we pointed out there that the people that they have already set up to take the blame for that are an alleged domestic extremist group that they're claiming will be white supremacists working with Iran. And of course, it makes no sense if you think about it, why a white supremacist would work with Iranians, but the way they're going, the glue they're using to stick those two groups together is claiming that they're both united in their extreme anti-Semitism. And it's worth pointing out too, the similarities to the 2001 official narrative about September 11th and the anthrax attacks, or rather the initial narrative of the anthrax attacks before that was disproven, that it was Iraq working with a group of terrorists, Al-Qaeda, which of course Al-Qaeda, as we know, was created by the CIA. And it's no coincidence that a lot of these domestic terror groups that are being marched in front of the American public right now is a reason to be afraid. For example, with the Governor Whitmer plot, we now know was incredibly infiltrated by the FBI. The ringleader of that plot was an FBI undercover informant who was paid $24,000 to set up what is essentially a fake terror plot, the same tactic used against Muslim Americans in the aftermath of 9/11. So all of that background is important to keep in mind while we're watching this clip here.
Absolutely. And we also see FBI claiming that they already have undercover individuals in regard to what's going to be happening coming up to the election. I mean, it's
right.
The New York Times has covered this before as well, that even the New York Times, as well as all the independent media, the FBI is involved with something like 90% of the claims that they claim to stop. I have a hand in creating. I mean, that's just staggering, but crazy.
Yeah, and they cover up the real crimes, like the Epstein scandal.
Right,
anyway.
right.
Moving along.
And we are not losing sight of jihadi terrorism and the threat that it continues to pose, but there is no doubt these statistics do not lie. The rise of domestic terrorism and the anti-Semitic threads running through it are an incredibly real problem. I've got people in my community, people in communities throughout this country that are afraid to go outside wearing their kippah, afraid to congregate, afraid to observe the high holy days.
Except in New York where they're protesting outside and whatever else, but no big deal. But statistics happen to lie all the time, by the way. That's a completely false statement.
And people generally are now afraid to do things that they were not afraid to do just a few years ago. We have certainly seen the rise of a global neo-Nazi white nationalist movement that is deserving of our attention.
You mean like in Ukraine? We're not supposed to say that one though, right?
No. But remember how they're calling the people like behind the Governor Whitmer plot, they started calling them vanilla ISIS. Notice what this guy was saying, that he's basically linking, he talked about jihadi terror and then immediately goes to this global network of neo-Nazi stuff. If you go back, by the way, and you didn't watch our video about the coronathrax experiment and the stuff about the seeding for this bioterror attack narrative later on in the year in the darkest winter and all of that, you should really go back and watch it, because we explored a lot of who they're going to blame in terms of the alleged domestic actors in pretty great detail there.
Experts have said that this looks like what Al-Qaeda looked like in the 80s and the 90s.
So predictable.
Let's not find ourselves asleep at the wheel.
How do they even argue that they look even remotely close to what that? I mean, that's incredible, but it's perfect timing. It's exactly
well, actually, if you think about it, it does make sense, because Al-Qaeda was, I mean, even now the U.S. is supporting Al-Qaeda in Syria and Yemen. They've always been, they always have been a front for U.S. intelligence. They were created to be that. You had people like Jamal Khashoggi embedded with Al-Qaeda in the 1980s during Operation Cyclone, which began under the Carter administration. Millions upon millions of dollars more funneled to Al-Qaeda during the 1980s by the Reagan administration, the same administration responsible for Iran-Contra. And a lot of those people later went on to be part of the George W. Bush administration, and also Papa Bush, right? So I mean, it's just outrageous. So in that sense, yeah, a lot of these supposed domestic extremist groups are also infiltrated by the military or the feds or intelligence, right? So I guess in that sense, he's not wrong, but of course that's not what he wants you to think. But
Right. Right.
Freudian slip perhaps.
Yes, he's correct when you're actually looking at the facts, right? But when you listen to the narrative, that doesn't make any sense. So that's kind of confusing, right? Don't just trust what the government says. Go back to sleep. That's the point.
Yeah.
Did in the run-up to 9/11. For so many people in my community, it feels like 9/11 was yesterday. These organizations, it is my opinion, and I'm not the only one, need to be identified as foreign terrorist organizations. And if they are not identified as foreign terrorist organizations, you need to tell us that we are still protected.
It's almost like he didn't know what he was going to say right there. He just didn't. He doesn't. We just tell us to designate them. Well, how can they be foreign if we're talking about a domestic? That doesn't even make sense to me. But it doesn't even matter, right?
Well, I think it's part of this narrative that they're trying to spin in that these alleged domestic extremists are part of a global network, which you sort of alluded to earlier, and that we sort of need to slap on them these quote unquote domestic.
Uh-oh, looked like we lost you for a second. Usually it will come right back, I hope. We'll see. Whitney, if you can hear me, I'm going to keep playing the video while your video catches up.
We need to know that when people in America go to train overseas, when people in America are recruited, when people try to come to America who have trained with these organizations.
Okay, sorry. If you were saying something, go ahead and say it. We lost you there for a minute. They cut out the internet connection. You still there? Ah, shoot. Looks like we're losing you again. But while it's connecting again, I'm sure we'll get you back. This is the point where he's saying right here that he's trying to make this tie, right? This is exactly what Whitney was just saying. He's making this connection as if they go overseas and train. We're talking about groups that are constitutionalists in some cases, and they're claiming that they're going overseas to train with Iran or some other group they're trying to conflate with this. It makes no sense at all. Are you back? Did you want to make some comments on that?
Yeah, I am back, but I lost my train of thought. I'm not really sure what's going on with my internet. Sorry about that. Just go ahead and run with the clip. It's fine.
Okay.
You have the same tools at your disposal that you do and have had in the fight against jihadi terrorism.
Earlier this month, FBI Director Wray testified that the Bureau had elevated racially motivated violent extremism to a threat level on par, kind of what Chairman Rose was talking about it, with Islamist terrorism. In response, the FBI has established a new fusion cell to better coordinate the response to domestic terrorism and hate crimes, and joint terrorism task forces across the United States have been instructed to increase their focus on domestic terrorism.
Wow. Okay, so really quick, that is the part of the FBI, that task force, right? The one that was involved in the entrapment of Muslim Americans to gin up the claim that there were all these Muslim extremists that were going to conduct terror attacks within the United States. And now he's saying that's merging with this new group that wants to focus on this threat of domestic terrorism. Well, there you go. This was in March, and I think that is the exact entity that was probably responsible for this Governor Whitmer plot, since we know now that it was an FBI informant leading the whole thing with 24 grand to spend. Unbelievable.
Exactly. Yeah. And I had these up just so people can look into it, so you understand what these are. What he just, gave you the rundown there. And this is some crazy stuff. And you'll see as they go forward with this video, they're talking about these. So this is essentially these fusion centers where they're working with communities and different groups. And you'll be surprised to find out which one of those groups are. And he'll drop it here in a second. But you need to ask yourself, if these groups are working with them and they're the ones giving them information, is it possible that they're the ones in some part either guiding it or leading the direction of who they go after or who they frame? Certainly a good question to ask. Let's go back to the video.
My mind is already blown.
Yeah.
We're just starting. Oh, man.
Collaborating,
Oh, sorry.
communicating at a high level in joint terrorism task forces across the country, and also within the numerous fusion centers throughout the nation. Our partnerships include non-law enforcement agencies from tech companies to faith-based organizations like the Anti-Defamation League.
Oh, there it is. So tech companies
Oh,
and the ADL are essentially seeding them with information, which they use to then go after terrorists. You think that's important, Whitney?
Yeah, because the ADL, their biggest funders are members of the mega group that I talk about in my Epstein series, historically anyway, like the Bronfman family, And people like that have long been Ronald Lauder, huge funders of that organization. We also know that Pierre Omidyar, who we've talked about before, is the person that gave ADL the seed money to set up their quote unquote hate lab in Silicon Valley. And Pierre Omidyar, of course, has been at the forefront of trying to deplatform independent media as quote unquote fake news and this whole fact checker thing. And, that whole initiative has been partnered with the ADL, and the ADL has a history of functioning as a lobby organization for the Israeli government and trying to criminalize criticism of Israel's government as anti-Semitic, and trying to, anyone that stands up for Palestinian rights or supports the boycott and divestment sanctions movement, or BDS, the ADL essentially labels them as anti-Semitic. I mean, they're a very problematic organization that has, they certainly don't like the First Amendment as it relates to criticism of their organization. Also, the ADL was born out of an organization called B'nai B'rith, which is quite controversial. And well, I mean, that's a story for another day, but it's worth looking into the founding of the ADL and Leo Frank and things like that, and who they were set up to protect. Essentially, they also have longstanding ties to the National Crime Syndicate and the Meyer Lansky organized crime mob going back decades. So to see them partnering with the federal government in what has already appeared to have resulted in a fake terror plot is really alarming.
Very, very much so. I mean, the ADL itself, just let's say the use of anti-Semitism to remove genuine criticism of government actions is exactly what they use, a lot of groups use to remove genuine things that need to be discussed. And they argue that maybe that's not what they say, but that's what they mean. And now they're deciding what we're implying with statements, and then we're just supposed to assume that they might not just have that opinion outside of the thing they say. And this is the way that they apply these things. And by the way, this video in the last part of here gets into exactly the idea of free speech and your constitutional rights.
Mm-hmm.
And you'll find it interesting what she has to say, that it happens to bump up against other people's fear. And I'm sure you guess which one trumps which. Let's watch.
I can tell you from my time in the upper Midwest, one of our best partners was and still is the Jewish Community Relations Council of Minnesota and the Dakotas. These relationships are working. In just the first quarter of this fiscal year, these types of partnerships have assisted JTTFs across the country in disrupting and arresting 38 terrorism subjects right here in the United States. I think there are two particular...
So just so we didn't miss that, we're talking about Joint Terrorism Task Force with these community members, and that specific Jewish community, along with the ADL, were insisting with their stopping these groups that were supposed to, we have to wonder whether or not there's some other agendas playing in with all of this, right? I mean, that's an obvious question.
Drawn out. The first is the way in which online platforms catalyze hate. Of a rabbi whose children were targeted online, and I'm very encouraged by Adi and Sanborn to see that they are looking to try to use all the tools that they currently have to try to go after such horrible things. But the fact is that our law enforcement community feels hamstrung. And how do you go after and balance First Amendment rights to free speech? While at the same time, how do you not acknowledge that innocent children being projected with images online that will forever be online? What about their rights?
Their rights to what? Not have things on the internet that may come across their view?
She's talking about that reference she made to that rabbi's kids being bullied. But like, what about all the kids? And I mean, they're not worried about like the exploitation of children by people like Jeffrey Epstein. Why didn't you investigate that, losers? Well, what about all the children the U.S. government bombs abroad, and sanctions and all of this stuff. I mean, it's really a transparent posturing here that they're trying. I mean, it just honestly sounds like they're pandering to a specific lobby here.
Totally. Well, but the point is not to say that what happened to these children is not something that shouldn't happen, or so. There's already laws in the books that go after things like this. What she's saying there is that that they feel hamstrung because your rights are getting in the way of them stopping that from happening. That's what she just said, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
so she's making the statement that that's what we need to alleviate. And the idea is that their rights, and what rights does she mean? People post things online. First of all, they're assuming that they know what those person's intentions were and that it wasn't some group that's trying to make the case for why this needs to happen. So you see what I mean? They've already shown examples of people faking things like this, and not just about anti-Semitism, but all cases. So, so it's a broad thing, not just about this one discussion. But I find that to be incredibly obvious that they're saying that that is the issue. Your rights get in the way of them protecting people from having things happen to them, or in regard to online, or that she just said that they're on the internet forever. Like, so this is a really obvious thing that's applying to the broad sense of just things being there. Like, so they go and look at them and that's your fault, right?
Right.
Go ahead.
Well, really quick, I wanted to add, well, we're going to get more into this later, but a lot of the companies we're going to be talking about have ties not just to U.S. intelligence, but Israeli intelligence. And of course, after any sort of another 9/11 takes place, anyone that would point the finger at the Israeli involvement, perhaps, they set it up as, oh, it's anti-Semitism from the get-go now. I mean, this is from March, right? And so, it's definitely a way to clamp down on anyone that would attempt to investigate the event after the fact and sort of dismiss them as sympathizers to whatever this domestic group is going to be, saying it's all anti-Semitism, or if you oppose a war with Iran, it's because you're anti-Semitic as well, among other things. I mean, we have seen groups like the ADL throw the anti-Semitic label around and try and tack it to things that are honestly just ludicrous. So, I mean, I think that's part of why this is being set up here, because a lot of the companies, for example, Cybereason, which is one of the companies we're going to be talking about today, was founded by members of Israeli intelligence, but of course, as I mentioned, also considerable ties to U.S. intelligence and the Project for a New American Century neocons. But, this is a way of stopping debate. And, a former foreign minister for Israel even admitted, I think on Democracy Now! Several years ago, she said that the anti-Semitism label is a trick. That's her term. She says we always use it when we don't want people to criticize us or clamp down on debate. And what do you know? What's going on here? I mean, it's just quite telling what they're setting up here.
She mentions it in this. I don't have it in this clip, but there's a part where a different person mentions the idea that there are people, spray painting things and saying that, Jews are behind 9/11. And that one statement, whoever made that, we don't know who it could be from, is something that is then used to point out that anybody saying that Israel's government was in any way involved is then that's what they really mean. And so the question should be genuinely asked whether things like that are being done, not that they don't actually happen in real life, but could be being done in places where people like this can talk about it so that that statement can be made, right? And this is something that the groups, again, troll farms, whether Israeli, United States, or any other country, are openly admitting to that they do today. Not just spray painting things and blaming people, but using psychological manipulations and counterintelligence. They've done this forever. That's literally what they do. So it's not wrong to ask those questions, because we're talking about the Israeli government and the crimes that they're, I think, clearly involved in.
And so there's that tension there. And then we also know that we have these organizations or movements or individuals that some of them are very sophisticated. They know exactly how far they can go. They're training their people to say, you can go this far, but not any farther. They are being sophisticated in both their communications and in their messaging. So
this is an interesting point about QAnon they just recently brought up. And this is the idea that what she's saying there is, well, they're not doing the thing that we just said was bad. They're just under the bar now. But now because they are hiding, we have to take it even further. And how long will that continue until it's just, you can't say anything even remotely insinuating these kind of things, right? And that's how this continues to escalate.
Good point.
We're playing a game and we are not equipped to go after that game effectively because of the rules that we are using.
Wow, there it is.
Quite frankly, designed 50 years ago. So I think it's probably time to take a fresh look. We do regulate other parts of speech over airwaves. It's hard for me to understand why on the online side, we're not willing to look at that.
Because we're talking about radio shows and not individuals posting individual comments online, which is what she's talking about. But sure, your rights just get in our way, right? That's what she's saying right there.
That's outrageous. I mean, we're in the months since this happened, people have to remember this was being said, this testimony happened in March. I mean, just look at the social media censorship efforts and efforts to curb speech online. All of how that has advanced over the course of this year. And obviously, if there is some sort of false flag event, another 9/11, as these people are warning, you can just imagine what other kinds of controls they'll try and, put on the internet.
Absolutely. And this last part is where the big statement is made here in regard to that.
Mm-hmm.
Second thing you raised about the domestic terrorist groups and movements being designated, I think it's definitely worth looking at whether we need a new DTO designation or movement designation, or maybe just relook at the whole entire framework. The national security apparatus is designed for a threat from 2030.
You want to comment?
No, I'm just, wow, I mean, we can see where this is going. People like us have been warning that this was going to happen for a long time. So it's really crazy to hear her lay it all out, I guess.
Insinuate a technocratic revolution, our entire infrastructure revolution. Yes, yeah.
Yeah, well, it's basically like, she's like, we could make a new designation for them, but that can't really work. So we have to remake the whole framework so it fits what we want it to fit. I mean, that's essentially what she's saying. And they did that after 9/11. Remember, they remade the whole national security apparatus, the intelligence community, to expand it and remake information sharing between agencies, what they wanted. They claimed that was the reason 9/11 happened, is because there wasn't enough information sharing between agencies. So that, of course, opened pretty much every part of the US government to the US intelligence community. They can get in and see whatever the rest of them were doing and all of that stuff, right? So, I mean, it's the same playbook these people follow every damn time. It's nuts.
And clearly it worked out great for Americans, right? And everyone, this is perfect. It all worked out for us, right?
Yeah. Here's DHS that was going to prevent terrorism, and here they are essentially talking about in advance exactly what's going to happen, and working with the FBI and FBI entrapment plots. I mean, it's just these are the people manufacturing the crisis they're claiming to warn about. So,
And the world is changing, and every counterterrorism professional I speak to in the federal government and overseas feels like we are at the doorstep of another 9/11, maybe not something that catastrophic in terms of the visual or the numbers, but that we can see it building and we don't quite know how to stop it. And so this feels like one of those moments where having smart people, academics, lawyers, people that can appreciate that we as a country have abused authority in the past, McCarthyism, internment of Japanese during World War II. We don't have a great track record here. We need to do this wisely. And it probably is not
wisely
in our normal course of business. It feels like this is a time for some sort of bipartisan commission to go off and study this problem and come back with a holistic view of this.
Wow.
Well, I just want to point out the thing that she said, this is a top lady at DHS, by the way. She said every counterterrorism professional she speaks with in the US government agrees, they all agree we're on the doorstep of another 9/11. That was how many months ago now? Back in March, right? So a lot's happened since then. I guess we're a little past the doorstep now, per her. And she also says counterterrorism professionals overseas, we can assume those are the US's closest allies, counterterrorism professionals in the United Kingdom, the Five Eyes countries, and Israel.
Mm-hmm. It's just crazy to watch this so plainly happening. And it's so, what really is incredible to me is that the things that you've been writing about and predicting this stuff and just literally calling what's going to happen. And yet, I mean, and even getting pretty spread, people are talking about it. I mean, people are mentioning you on the Joe Rogan show just the other day. And yet, nonetheless, it seems as if people still are afraid to point this out. It's happening right in front of us, and you called it months ago, right? I mean, I just don't understand.
Well, this is controversial information. A lot of people don't want to put their reputation or, their YouTube channels or things like that on the line, right? But honestly, in my opinion, based on what they're trying to do here, we are out of time for that. If I wanted to think about preserving my career, well, based on what they're setting up, in this clampdown on online speech that will follow this event, I won't have a career. So it's sort of one of those moments like speak up now or forever hold your peace, is how I see it.
Or forever be forced to, yeah.
Right, yeah, against your will. So with that being said, I don't know if you have anything else to share on that point in terms of that testimony from the DHS people, or I can just go into my series back from January about that sort of predicted a lot of what we're seeing now.
Yeah, please continue.
Alrighty, so just give me 1 second here. So after my Epstein series, I did another series on a company that has some ties to some of the same actors, Israeli intelligence and also US intelligence, called Cyber Reason. This is back when I wrote for Mint Press News. As you can see here, this is part 1 of the series. It came out on January 4th, 2020. It's a 3-part series. The last one, I believe, came out on January 28th, 2020. I ended up highlighting the version of my article of that same article I republished in my site Unlimited Hangout, just because I think it's a little easier to read and highlight than the how Mint Press has their color scheme set up. So first off, I'm going to go into what company Cyber Reason is, and why it matters, and then talk a little bit about their election simulations and what they predicted. And obviously, I think a lot of people will pick up on the similarities between what Cyber Reason predicted over a year in advance and what's happening now, and wondering if any of these extreme intelligence ties have anything to do with it.